Welcome to the fourth lecture covering Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. In this lecture, we're going to be covering the chapter titled Self-Consciousness. This chapter, Self-Consciousness, of course, has already worked through what is consciousness, where we covered first the way in which consciousness presents itself in sensual immediacy, before working itself up towards a logical necessity. When we now cover self-consciousness, what we're doing is we are taking self-consciousness itself as an object and trying to understand first the way self-consciousness starts to recognize itself, and secondly, the way self-consciousness comes to constitute itself in a realm of other self-consciousnesses, and then third, the way consciousness goes through spiritual evolution or spiritual development towards a knowledge of being for self. So, consequently, in the first part of this lecture, we are going to be covering the way self-consciousness functions as what Hegel would refer to as a active synthetic universal. Second, we'll be covering the way self-consciousness is structured formatively in the social realm between an asymmetrical lord-bondsman relationship or an asymmetrical master-slave relationship. And then third, we are going to be studying the logical dynamics of self-consciousness's spiritual development, although in the actual spiritual development of self-consciousness, it is not experienced as logical, but rather through the lens of emotional catastrophes. Starting here with the first dimension of self-consciousness, in terms of the ego as an active synthetic universal, the ego here is synthesizing the world logically, trying to structure the world in logical categories which make sense for its historical being. This, of course, is done through the faculties of the intellect, the modes of interpretation that the ego will deploy in order to make sense of externality, to make sense of the important different categories populating its phenomenological existence. And of course, in categorically synthesizing all of these different domains of externality, we'll hopefully also develop some pragmatic mastery of an understanding of these phenomena. So, for example, depending on what it is that is of necessary determination for the synthetic universal ego, you will not only want to understand externality in categories, but also be able to transform, manipulate, and work with this externality in different ways. We could use examples of a typical university-educated synthetic universal ego, like a physicist or a biologist, but it does not remain isolated to simply university categories. Of course, if you are a teacher, if you are a sanitary engineer, if you are a bureaucrat, or whatever the function, pardon me, whatever the function is, you will not only want an adequate intellectual interpretation of the phenomena, but also pragmatic mastery of the phenomena. So here to quote Hegel on this part, quote, "In the previous modes of certainty, what is true for consciousness is something other than itself, but the notion of this vanishes in the experience of it. What the object immediately was in itself, mere being in sense certainty, the concrete thing of perception, and for the understanding, a force, proves to be in truth not this at all. Instead, this in itself turns out to be a mode in which the object is only for another." So This quote is both a combination of what we just talked about and a foreshadowing of the next slide. What this quote refers to in relation to what we just discussed was the notion of intellectual interpretation of externality, that the certainty and truth of consciousness was operating external to itself. But what Hegel is now foreshadowing for the next slide is that this truth and this certainty was only for another, meaning that it wasn't a truth for the self-consciousness in itself, which we'll get to now. Which is to say that the ego comes to recognize that it has not pragmatically mastered itself. In other words, intellectual interpretation in focusing on external phenomena has not been able yet to properly interpret and pragmatically master its own ego. Consequently, even if you are a extremely successful active synthetic universal ego, whatever the determination, like we discussed, physics, biology, or teacher, or sanitary engineer, or bureaucrat, or whatever the function is, you can be extremely successful in all of these realms and yet be extremely disappointed and unimpressed with your own self-reflection, meaning that you do not yet have a pragmatic mastery of yourself. And that's why Hegel said that the notion was for an other, and that the truth and certainty of this notion vanishes. It vanishes because the ego recognizes that it was not the truth and certainty of itself. So we'll get here the next quote. Consciousness as self-consciousness henceforth has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense certainty and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative, and the second, itself, which is the true essence, and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. In this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which this antithesis is removed, and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for it. End quote. So that quote captures what I'm saying here about that the self-consciousness, when it comes to hold itself as an object and is unimpressed with its own reflection, holds itself as a double object, and the second object has the character of a negative, and that the self-consciousness wants to work to remove this negativity. The self-consciousness wants to basically start to understand itself, to interpret itself, and to develop a self-reflection, to develop a image of itself that it can be proud of, essentially, that it can look itself in the mirror, that it can be confident in as a truth and certainty for itself. And this entire dimension here that Hegel dialecticizes on the level of self-consciousness is not really something that we build in to our intellectual institutions. They're not something that we build in to our processes of development. We just kind of leave intellectual development on that first level and don't recognize here this internal process where self-consciousness is unimpressed with itself. So then moving on to this third level, the self-consciousness here goes into a life and death struggle with itself. So as Hegel said in the previous slide, it enters into a negative relationship with this double object and will sacrifice itself for the erasure of this negative self-image, will start to act in ways that will ensure that this negative image is destroyed and annihilated, and so that it can look at itself in the mirror, so to speak. And this is what Hegel would refer to as a internal life and death struggle. And what that means is that inside of itself, as we'll see in the next quote, towards the ego's relationship to the inwardness of things, would risk it all for the sole center of universality, which is basically the truth and certainty of self, which of course is not the ego, but is the universal, true and certain dimension of being. So we'll get into that quote here. Quote, "What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being, also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is a living thing. For the in itself, or the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things, is the distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished, or the unity of what is distinguished. Self-consciousness, which is simply for itself and directly characterizes its object as a negative element, or as primarily desire, will therefore, on the contrary, learn through experience that the object is independent." Okay, so that's a big quote, but it's an important one, and it's a good concluding chapter on the motion of the active synthetic ego. The first thing is that what the ego really desires is a living thing, which is mastery of itself. So if you've only mastered non-conscious, non-living things, then you will ultimately not be approaching the highest level of spiritual development. And this is why people on lower levels of spiritual development, so to speak, will try to control others, will try to, this can happen, of course, in sexual relationships, this can happen in friendships, this can happen on the political level, this can happen at work, this can happen in many different contexts. What it means is that they don't have control of themselves, and they actually don't like their own self-image, they don't like their own self-reflection, they don't like what they see in the mirror. And instead of doing the hard work of negativity, the hard work of transforming oneself into something that one can be proud of, one would rather control the other because they can't control themselves, basically. And that's why he says what is desired is a living thing, and that this desire for the living thing is no different than an understanding of the inwardness of things. This is why on higher levels of spiritual development, the ego will turn inward instead of projecting externally. And that this is first not to be distinguished, meaning that you can't put a signifier on what it is positively. And if it is distinguished, it can only be distinguished as a unity. Of course, the ego or the self-consciousness is not a unity, it's divided within itself. And so it is this here negativity which is mobilized to be with the unity type of inwardness of universality. And that here's an interesting thing that will come up in later slides, which is that the object as a negative element, this obstacle, is necessary for the emergence of desire in Hegel. So desire is always signifying a negativity, because you wouldn't desire something if your present wasn't a negativity. Desire emerges in that gap, so to speak, that internal division with self. So that's here to summarize these different relational levels of the subject's ego. You first have the actively functional, categorically synthetic universal, particular universality, where the ego is trying to logically mediate all phenomena and create a logical set of categories for itself to pragmatically master. On the second level, the ego comes to recognize that it is disappointed and unimpressed with itself, its own self-reflection, and so will then set up a double object internal split within itself to try to develop some pragmatic self-mastery. And then third, the ego will undergo a life and death struggle with itself for the universality of the inwardness of things, the universal that it can sense, not in sense certainty or perception, but more a rational universality within itself that is, I think, be fair to call suprasensible. Okay, so on to this second part. Now we're going to be dealing with self-consciousness on the level of intersubjectivity, or the social level of self-consciousness. And for Hegel, this is a domain which is organized by egos and organized specifically by mechanisms of egoic recognition. Not only do the egos relate to each other and need things from each other, but they also require certain modes of recognition from each other. And these different modes of recognition from each other, which we'll be studying in the slides coming up, become again internally divided between two. And so you get, again, this pattern of, in the same way the ego internally fractures into a negativity, the same thing happens on the social level, where the social level fractures into a negativity. So another sort of a meta-level theme here in the dialectic. So, quote, self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The notion of this, its unity, in its duplication, embraces many and varied meanings. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. End quote. Okay, so this sets up the social domain for Hegel, and you can see here that self-consciousness, its own identity, is intimately wrapped up, is intimately entangled with other self-consciousnesses. This is especially important when the ego is still on the first level of its external projections of universality, because what it thinks is external phenomena that it's logically categorizing is in fact dependent on a network of other self-consciousnesses, which are basically being mediated for different desires for recognition from other self-consciousness. The outside, in other words, the outside world is not really the point. The point is more the desire for recognition from other self-consciousnesses. That's why Hegel says this domain sets us up with understanding the process of recognition. And then the second thing Hegel's emphasizing here is that when self-consciousness is dependent on the recognition of other self-consciousnesses, it has essentially lost itself, meaning that the self-consciousness doesn't yet realize that it is divided within itself and is looking for recognition from other self-consciousnesses, basically to find itself again. Even though you won't really find yourself in another self-consciousness. That's why he's saying that on this level, the ego doesn't really see the other person. They only see themselves in the other self-consciousness. Very important dimension to reflect on in self, and the way in which we interact with each other. So, in this matrix, this social matrix, Hegel identifies that these processes of recognition, again, become divided between a lord and a bondsman, or a master and a slave. You might think that's outdated terminology. You might think that that's terminology better suited to the early 19th century. But essentially, this same dynamic is basically operating today to this day, and can be more generalized perhaps to language that is, like a boss and a worker, or a teacher and a student, it's basically just trying to get at some asymmetrical imbalance. But a higher and a lower. Of course, we don't have, as explicitly as existed in the early 19th century, masters and slaves. But essentially that formal social organization is much more general than those explicit categories. And of course, masters and slaves do still technically exist. So, quote, "At first, it will exhibit the side," this in regards to the social level, "at first it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes which, as extremes, are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Insofar as it is the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. In these moments, the Lord achieves his recognition through another consciousness. But for recognition proper, the moment is lacking, one-sided, and unequal. In this recognition, the unessential consciousness is for the Lord the object, which constitutes the truth of his certainty of himself." Okay, so again, that's a lot, but we'll work through it, and it's very important to understand for this section. So again, the social world fractions into two, a splitting up of the middle term here being recognition. So you have on the one side someone being recognized, the other recognizing. Of course, the master is the one being recognized, and the slave is the recognizing element. However, this asymmetry is a type of each seeking the death of the other, each unconsciously, you might say, and the unconscious here does function in Hegel. Each unconsciously would seek the death of the other. In other words, it's a zero-sum battle that both sides do not see themselves as winning in this arrangement, neither the master nor the slave. And the reason why is because it's not true recognition. It's not a form of recognition that is ultimately satisfactory for the truth of universality or the certainty of self, because it's based on this kind of splitting up. It's based on this inequality, as Hegel says. The recognition proper is lacking because it is one-sided and unequal. Essentially, if you're in the master position, you'll never really value the recognition of the slave. And if you're in the slave position, you will never really truly respect the master. So this is bound to produce a type of eternal conflict. This itself needs to be processed. It's a negativity. In precisely the same way that the internal split within the ego is a negativity which needs to be reconciled. But here, in regards to the Lord specifically, Hegel says that, and this is really the downfall of the Lord's position, is that his identity is dependent on the unessential consciousness. In other words, is dependent on the slave consciousness, which is constituting the truth of his own certainty of self. And that's ultimately not a good foundation for you to ground the truth of the certainty of yourself. So, paradoxically leading into that, what this means is that the slave here in Hegel is paradoxically in a superior position to the bondsman or the lord. The bondsman or the slave is in a superior position paradoxically to the lord or the master, because they're the ones actually doing real, essential, true work. And if they can, as it were, decouple their identity from from recognizing the master and really work on their own identity, they have the opportunity and the possibility to develop a true autonomy of self, independent of the master, much more convincingly and much more powerfully than the master, because the master's identity is actually totally dependent on the slave and the slave's work, which is again not a good situation for the master or the lord. So this quote here will capture this, and it's a very important one. Quote, "The truth of the independent consciousness is accordingly the servile consciousness of the bondsman. This, it is true, appears at first outside of itself and not as the truth of self-consciousness, but just as lordship showed that its essential nature is the reverse of what it wants to be, so too servitude in its consummation will really turn into the opposite of what it immediately is. As a consciousness forced back into itself, it will withdraw into itself and be transformed into a truly independent consciousness. But this pure universal movement, this absolute melting away of everything stable, is the simple essential nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for self, which consequently is implicit in this consciousness. This moment of pure being for self is also explicit for the bondsman, for in the Lord it exists for him as his object." So, I really love these quotes because they capture such a precise dynamic that is so important to internalize if you are a self-consciousness, which is looking for spiritual development and true spiritual progress, because this is grounded in a higher order social dynamic. And what can often happen is that if you're in these social relationships of the master and the slave, and you can just become frustrated, you can become disillusioned with reality, as we'll get to in future slides. But actually you can turn your situation into its opposite, because when you're in this horrible social dynamic, or what appears a horrible social dynamic, what Hegel says, you're forced back into self, to withdraw into self, and to become a truly independent consciousness through your work, or that is available to you. That is it's a spiritual message that's you can't escape the hard work. You can't escape the hard looking into yourself. You can't escape the how difficult it's going to be to achieve true spiritual independence. But it is available to you in this social dynamic, and that this, Hegel thinks, is a pure universal movement, and the essential nature of self-consciousness, which will require your old identity, which is too much clinging to the master structure, which is too clinging to the Lord structure in servitude. All that has to melt away, and that will be painful because your ego's identity will have to melt away. And that's why he says it's absolute negativity. But what you'll find in this absolute negativity is what he calls a pure being for self. And this is the process of true understanding of the inward universality of things, which we alluded to in the first section on the development of the ego. So, of course, what is missing in intersubjectivity, what is missing on the social order is equal recognition. Of course, it's fractured here in asymmetrically between the Lord and the bondsman. So the level of absence here, the negativity of the missing, you could say the egalitarian, equal mutual, what he says, equal mutual recognition and cooperative organization of a social ideal here is absent, but the absence of this form is what opens up the space for real work and real spiritual growth. And so the absence has a positive function in Hegel's dialectic, as here we'll see here. Quote, through work, however, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the lot of the bondsman, since in that relation the thing retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object, and thereby its unalloyed feeling of self. But this is the reason why this satisfaction is itself only a fleeting one, for it lacks the side of objectivity and permanence. Work, on the other hand, is desire held in check, fleetingness staved off. In other words, work forms and shapes the thing. So what's crucial here is that Hegel is flipping this negativity and to see the positivity that is emerging from negativity. Which is to say that the bondsman, which first has its identity too closely aligned to the Lord's, and then first sees that, or first perceives that he has a unessential relation to the thing, and that the thing is independent of whatever he does or she does. On the second motion, realizes that in the pure negation of the Lord, or in the pure negation of the master, comes to develop this relationship to the thing which is in itself and in the work of its own spiritual self-consciousness. And Hegel here creates a dichotomy between work and desire. So in other words, when the self-consciousness is in the mode of desire, it's as if you're separated from the thing. The thing is independent of you. But in the mode of work, you stave off desire and you form and shape the thing itself. So that's really important. And it's important in differentiation because we're here far separated here from Kant, because, of course, for Kant the thing in itself is just out there, the noumenal. But for Hegel, he's saying here that your work, your real spiritual work, is what forms and shapes the thing. It's about our spiritual becoming in history. It's about our relationship to the universal thing in itself that is dependent on our spiritual work. That's the essential dimension. So again, on the social level, these levels, first there's the Lord's recognition, which is a lower level, again, paradoxically. It's the biggest paradox of history, probably, that the people on the top are actually lower than the people on the bottom. Then you have the bondsman's recognition, which is a higher level. You have more access to accessing the inwardness of things and achieving real work. Then you have the inexistent ideal of the social order, mutual recognition and cooperative order, and that this inexistence of the ideal is, in fact, the negativity that's required for real self-work, and the real creation of the thing. So now on the level of spirituality, this picks up where we left off with the inexistent ideal, that, of course, in our social world, our ideal of a social world is far different than the actual social world. In other words, our ideal for social harmony is so distant from the reality of intersubjectivity that we can become extremely disillusioned with reality. We can become extremely pessimistic about the nature of history, about human nature, about even interacting with others, about giving into social games, about all of these dimensions. But this is part of the spiritual path. This is part of spiritual becoming, is recognizing this and basically using this negativity to work towards higher level of self. But the essential point here is just that as the rational ideal would determine, the social reality seems incredibly irrational and impossible. Quote, "The consciousness that is forced back into itself becomes, in its formative activity, its own object in the form of the thing it has fashioned, and at the same time sees in the Lord a consciousness that exists as a being for self, but for the subservient consciousness as such, these two moments, itself as an independent object, and this object as a mode of consciousness, and hence its own essential nature, fall apart." So what's only essential to emphasize there is that of these two moments falling apart, and this is what creates the inner disturbance with the social world. That we don't see this in its higher dialectical necessity. We don't see the positivity in the negativity. We don't see that our own self-work is an essential determination of the thing. That it's our formative activity here that is being called for, and that is a necessary stage in the process of history. So, in this process, what tends to happen, Hegel says on this level, is that we first go from recognizing the irrationality of the social world and its negativity. And then what happens is we go into a stoical or a skeptical fortress. In other words, we build an inner temple of reason, we build an inner temple of virtue, and we remove all theoretical and practical commitments from the outside. In other words, because we don't see a way in which the social world can be meaningfully participated in, because we can't see a way in order for us to externalize our reason, to engage meaningfully in an ideal and knowable world, we retreat into self. And this is a necessary phase, even though it's a part of a dialectical here that will eventually be transcended. The tendency of spirit to form a stoical and skeptical fortress is a necessary part of coming to self-knowledge, and it is a necessary part of inner knowing. Quote here, "This freedom of self-consciousness, when it appeared as conscious manifestation in the history of spirit, has, as we know, been called Stoicism. Its principle is that consciousness is a being that thinks, and that consciousness holds something to be essentially important, or true and good, only insofar as it thinks it to be such. This consciousness, accordingly, has a negative attitude toward the Lord and bondsman relationship. Its aim is to be free, and to maintain that lifeless indifference which steadfastly withdraws from the bustle of existence, alike from being active as passive, into the simple essentiality of thought. As a universal form of the world spirit, Stoicism could only appear on the scene in a time of universal fear and bondage, but also a time of universal culture, which had raised itself to the level of thought." End quote. So, to summarize what Hegel's trying to say here is that He's saying Stoicism is a part of the manifestation of world spirit, that it is a stage of world spirit which has come to recognize something true and good inside of consciousness, that this true and good inside of consciousness is something essential related to its own thinking, but that it has not yet realized or recognized how to externalize this true and good into the world. And that's why he says this form of consciousness has a negative relationship toward the Lord and bondsman relationship, because it is perceived as irrational. It is perceived as unjust. It is basically perceived to be not true and good, but false and bad. And that's why he said it takes a lifeless indifference to the social world, and privileges its own inner freedom over this social world, and thus withdraws from the bustle of existence, and so forth. And then says that Stoicism could have only appeared because of universal fear and bondage. In other words, because people are too fearful to really act in the world, Stoicism is a logical spiritual response. But so that's the negative element. But also, Stoicism couldn't have emerged if it didn't also persist in a time of universal culture. In other words, it has come to recognize that there is something inside that is universal, something inside that is universally true and good. So, after this stage, Hegel assumes, or Hegel dialecticizes, that self-consciousness transforms into a inner irrational identification with a mystical or unattainable beyond. So this is a stage. Now, on these three stages, the first being the disappointment with the social world, the second being the Stoicism, and now this third being irrational identification with a mystical, unattainable beyond, self-consciousness can get stuck at any one of these stages, and you could die at one of these stages. It's not necessarily that you'd get to one of these stages and then necessarily overcome it for the next stage. There are many people who simply remain to the end of their days negative about social life and just stay there. There are many people who become stoical and just take that as a spiritual mode, as the highest spiritual mode. And then there are many people who get attached to an irrational, mystical beyond and just stay there until the end. What happens at this third stage of irrational identification with a mystical, unattainable beyond is that your inner stoical, skeptical fortress cannot hold itself as a inner circular totality, and it must find its ideal cause somewhere outside of itself. But because it can't see the reason in that possibility being externalized in the social world, it has to project it into a mystical world. It has to project it into a beyond. Of course, this could be heaven in several Christian or other spiritual traditions. It is some afterlife. It is some beyond of the present life and the physical world. Quote, raising itself out of this consciousness, it goes over into the unchangeable. But this elevation is itself this same consciousness. It is therefore directly consciousness of the opposite, of itself as a particular individual. The unchangeable that enters into consciousness is through this very fact at the same time affected by individuality and is only present with the latter. Individuality, instead of having been extinguished in the consciousness of the unchangeable, only continues to arise therefrom. So what he's saying here is that because the changing world of appearances is unbearable and irrational, the rational ideal projects itself into the unchangeable. But what Hegel's saying is that this is just the motion of the same consciousness. This is just consciousness projecting itself, projecting its own rational ideal into itself. So he's basically saying that when people imagine heaven or God or some other unchangeable reality that's outside of our reality, this is just merely the projected rational ideal externalized and separated from self at a certain level of spiritual becoming of world spirit. So here you have the three levels again of spiritual becoming. You have rational ideal, recognizing that the social world is not rational and not the inner dream or inner ideal. You have the construction of an inner fortress, of a stoical, skeptical self-prison or self-fortress. Then, third, you have irrational identification with a mystical, unattainable beyond, which is a place where spirit will go when it dies, or a place where spirit will go after this world, after this life. And then finally, we have the job of the phenomenologist. The job of the phenomenologist is to logically ascertain the process of this dialectical becoming of spirit, and to see the reason in it, to see the logical development of it, from a non-emotional position, because in the process of all these transformations, they're always extremely emotional. They're experienced as emotional catastrophes. But the job of the phenomenologist is to try to develop a logical understanding. So the first here is that the transition towards this mystical, unattainable beyond is something that develops in self-consciousness, basically out of sheer despair of the absurdity of the world. So you could say on the one level, people become nihilistic. You could say on the one level that people become nihilistic about, again, social reality, about human nature, about the meaning of history, about the meaning of their lives, about the meaning of being a consciousness at all. And that inner despair is just of the pure absurdity of existence. The fact that existence seems so absurd from the perspective of the rational ideal, and that the rational ideal inside oneself seems so true and good, and yet so distant, and the negativity is so strong that all you can do is wallow in what he says, wallow in a self-abasing mysticism. So that is the logic of that position. The logic of that position comes from the sheer enormity of the gap between rational ideality and the external reality, just how absurd it is. Quote, "What is set forth here as the mode and relationship of the unchangeable has appeared as the experience through which the divided self-consciousness passes in its wretchedness. Now this experience, it is true, is not its own one-sided movement, for it is itself the unchangeable consciousness, and this, consequently, is at the same time a particular individual consciousness too. And the movement is just as much a movement of the unchangeable consciousness, which makes its appearance in that movement as much as the other." End quote. So you see here that the relationship the self-consciousness sets up to the unchangeable mystical beyond is something that emerges from the divide, from the gap internal to self-consciousness, which Hegel describes as a wretchedness. But that this divide where in wretchedness, where the self-consciousness projects the unchangeable, is just a projection of itself, and it's a one-sided movement, so that the ultimate confrontation with true self-knowledge is being delayed in the end. So after this wallowing, self-abasing mysticism, where one may, in fact, be confronted with some external catastrophe or some external or inner catastrophe, where this unchangeable projection has to be confronted in itself as self, as this enormous negativity of one's own truth and one's own certainty. Something could happen, and this is again a higher level of consciousness, where one says, okay, no matter how absurd the world is, no matter how negative this, and no matter how big this divide is inside self, this rational ideal has to come out. This rational ideal has to be made manifest. It has to be made actual. We have to push towards a rational actualization, which is which can be seen and felt and heard and so forth in natural social arrangements, which are knowable, enjoyable, and improvable for all. And that is the mode in which the work of the thing in itself and one's own self-consciousness is one thing. In other words, your own self-consciousness, your own day-to-day everydayness of work, and this knowable, enjoyable, improvable, rational ideal are one thing. This is what Hegel's trying to say here. Quote, if at first the mere notion of the divided consciousness was characterized by the effort to set aside its particular individuality and to become the unchangeable consciousness, its efforts from now on are directed rather to setting aside its relation with the pure formless unchangeable and to coming into relation only with the unchangeable in its embodied or incarnate form. For the oneness of the particular individual with the unchangeable is henceforth the essence and the object of this consciousness. Just as in the mere notion of it, the formless, abstract, unchangeable was the essential object, and the relation of this absolute dividedness of the notion is now what has to turn away from. The initial external relation to the incarnate unchangeable as an alien reality has to be transformed into a relation in which it becomes absolutely one with it. So that's basically what I just said in the previous slide, which is that this unchangeable mystical beyond has to be something that's embodied and incarnate. So here you get the idea of Hegel's influence of Christianity, where, like, for example, Jesus' resurrection was an embodied resurrection. That you cannot keep the transcendent beyond in this transcendent beyond as an abstract, formless entity. It has to be something which is embodied in this world. It has to be something in which we give it form. We give this unchangeable its form. And that's why he says that this unchangeable as an alien reality, as a mystical beyond, we have to, through our own transformation, have to become absolutely one with it. So, in the end, for the phenomenologist, the phenomenologist's job is to analyze the logical sequence of this process. To analyze the logical sequence of the transformation from the experience of egoic self-consciousness, where we started, to true self-consciousness, the true certain self-consciousness, as a logical pattern, as a logical sequence, as we've just tried to do in this lecture. Because the reason why this is necessary, the reason why the phenomenologist is necessary, is because, again, while historical forms of consciousness are going through this process, they do not see the whole logic of the process, and they can get stuck at certain levels of the process. And probably in order to get unstuck from certain levels of the process, they have to undergo an emotional transformation, and the phenomenologist should be there to mediate that process if our society was to understand the historical meaning of phenomenology as Hegel meant it to be articulated. So, the final quote here: The movement in which the unessential consciousness strives to attain this oneness is itself threefold in accordance with the threefold relation this consciousness will have with its incarnate beyond. First, as pure consciousness. Second, as a particular individual who approaches the actual world in the forms of desire and work. And third, as consciousness that is aware of its own being for self. We have now to see how these three modes of being are present and determined in that general relationship. So, the mystical beyond is first a pure consciousness away from it. Second, it is recognized in its own desire and work. And third, it is held as a being for self. And this is self-consciousness' knowledge of what is true and certain. Again, self-consciousness as a being for self. And that is the fourth lecture on Phenomenology of Spirit, focused on self-consciousness. If you're interested, there are 3 previous lectures I've done covering Phenomenology of Spirit on the foreword, the introduction, and consciousness. I'll leave links in the description to those if you haven't watched them yet. And if you benefit from this lecture and if you want to get more content from me, if you want to stay up to date with this channel and my other work that I do, and if you just want to support me being able to grow this channel and to grow in my own becoming, I massively appreciate anyone who decides to support me on Patreon. And there are different tiers on Patreon where you can get more involved in philosophy, where you can get more involved in learning how this content can directly relate to your life, and where you can directly interact with me on a regular basis. So thank you so much for staying with me throughout this lecture. I hope it was beneficial to you. And that was the 4th lecture of Phenomenology of Spirit.